The book is about an American Foreign Service officer, and the story starts off, he is in the hospital, he's had a stroke, he can't talk, but his mind is still very active. The story is about him being in China during the founding of the Chinese Communist, well, not the Communist Party, but while they were fighting the Japanese during World War II. He comes back to the States after the end of World War II and gets fired because he's suspected of being a communist. So I wanted to explore a bit about what that means psychologically, and just trying to understand his story internally. It's told from 7 different perspectives, which makes it kind of complicated. I initially had 7 unique chapters, but my brother suggested that I mix things up. The person that this story is based on is John Service, and he actually went through this struggle of being fired by the Foreign Service, later getting reinstated. But he went through hell to get reinstated, and he got his back pay and his pension and all that. But there was a time where he couldn't get a job because he had been blacklisted. He couldn't get hired by anybody. He got a job over in New York working for a steam trap company. So imagine being a political reporter in China, having dealt with Chairman Mao, you know, in a wartime situation, coming back to the States and working for a steam trap company. So that's the sort of stuff I was trying to understand more. Unfortunately, the actual person, John Service, didn't keep a diary of his time in Yan'an, which is what Taoyuan is based on in the book. So I kind of had to make things up. There's a lot of people, a lot of Americans who were in Yan'an during that time. They didn't write diaries either. So the diary that you see is a sort of a composite of lots of different stories going on there. All right, so I'm going to read just a short passage from the first chapter. So the narrator of this book her name is Lisa. She's Chinese American, and she's the person in charge of taking care of Leach, Quentin Leach, who's the person who had the stroke. He's the Foreign Service officer. So the one thing that still bothers me, so she's talking about the past. She's now an adult. She has a house. Her mortgage is underwater. She has kids in school. The one thing that still bothers me whenever I think back to that time in 1989 is what happened while I was working as a student intern at a retirement home in Albany, California. I just graduated from UC Berkeley, and I got a paid internship at St. Matthew's Senior Care, which was located just north of Berkeley. Most of the residents at St. Matthew's were either comatose or delusional and had to be medicated regularly. St. Matthew's was where senior citizens went to die. I was living in a studio apartment in Lake Merritt in Oakland with another Chinese American girl who was in her last year at Berkeley. She spent most of her time studying at cafes with her organic chemistry study group. They drank mochas and talked about valence bonds. I had no aspirations to go into healthcare. I landed the job at St. Matthew's through a friend of my mother's who owned a chain of Cantonese-style takeout restaurants and had recently bought St. Matthew's as a place to stash his 95-year-old mother. My job was to clean bedpans, pick up laundry, and do whatever else the nurses asked me to do. Grunt work was reserved for people like me because it was cheaper than paying nurse union wages. I worked 4 days a week. I had 25 residents to look after during my 4-hour shift, and on good days the rooms smelled like pine sol. On bad days they smelled like urine. There were 8 nurses on the day shift. 3 were Filipino. They did most of the work. The other 5 non-Filipino nurses showed up for work and did very little. If the weather was good, the nurses wheeled residents out to the garden so they could get some sunshine. If it was raining, the nurses wheeled the residents into the movie room and popped in a VHS tape of My Three Sons, Mayberry RFD, or other shows. The nurses, meanwhile, were hooked on Jeopardy and The Price is Right. I had been at St. Matthew's only 2 weeks when Mr. Leach arrived. An ambulance brought him from Altamonte Hospital. One of the Filipino nurses said that Mr. Leach had suffered a stroke and had recently emerged from a coma. A doctor came by on the second day and said that Mr. Leach was paralyzed everywhere but his eyes. He couldn't speak or move. So this is something called locked-in syndrome, where you're unable to speak or move, but your brain is functioning somewhat, and you can have thoughts. So the story gets into his internal thoughts without him being able to say anything. And what happens is while he's in the hospital, his former lover from China comes and visits him. And Lisa's trying to figure out what the relationship is between this woman and Leach. And so that sort of drives the story. She wants to find out how these two met and what happened back in China back in 1940, 46, 45.
Can you tell us about your year in Beijing?
My year in Beijing? Okay, that sounded like a plant because that's my wife asking. So if you have time, you can see all these. I'm here in 1988 in Beijing University with all the foreign students. You probably can't see me, but I'm somewhere in here, and I'll challenge you to find me because I had more hair. I was there the year before Tiananmen. There was a lot of protesting going on about corruption, about opportunities for students. But it kind of died down in the summertime because it gets really, really hot in Beijing. And they also started sponsoring school dances. So if you think about protests and you think about sexuality like you had in the 60s, and this is really going out on a limb here, so don't quote me on this, but I kind of think that when you have students protesting, but then you have dances, that the protests sometimes die away. That obviously didn't happen the following year, and it was a very tragic thing what happened in 1989, because things got so bad in China with corruption, with nepotism. So when I was at Beijing University, a lot of students complained that the kids of higher officials were given jobs at the very nice government positions, and they were basically told, well, you've graduated from Beijing University, now go off to a faraway place and teach in an elementary school. And Beijing University, just so you know, is the top school in China. Everyone wants to go to Beijing University. We got to go there not because we were very smart, but because we were foreign exchange students, exactly. So we got to see these people, but all the foreign students were put into a foreign student dormitory. We weren't really allowed to mix. It was very interesting. The largest foreign student population was Japanese. So, of course, I had a Japanese girlfriend when I was studying in China. It makes perfect sense.
Can you say more about why you found it important to tell one story from 7 perspectives? And I mean, I haven't read the book, but a little bit about the 7 perspectives.
Yeah, so the book started off being called The 7 Versions of Leach. And so John Leach is the main character, John Quentin Leach, he goes by Quentin. The difficulty I had in writing this story, the person it's based on was not a very self-expressive person. And if you think about living in the 50s and you're a guy, you're not going to be saying what your feelings are necessarily. And so I had to get in the mind of this guy and figure out how is he going to reveal himself or not reveal himself. And a lot of the times he doesn't really reveal what he's thinking, so you need to have other perspectives to see what's going on and try and understand him a little better. The only time he's actually in first person, being first person, is the diary part. And the diary is not very emotionally honest because he's that type of person from that period. So he talks a lot about what's going on, but not what's in his head and what he's feeling. What I found in writing the story is that his wife's letters to her friend, so she's writing to her friend as she's being evacuated from Chongqing, those are probably the most revealing about him. But I didn't plan it that way. It just sort of happened as I was writing that, oh wow, his wife actually has a lot to say and she's actually telling me a lot about him that I didn't know. What I found in writing, like initially I would start off, this idea of you write 15 minutes every day did not work for me because I row in the morning, so I get up at 4:30 to row with some of these guys over here. And I work full-time at the Public Utilities Commission, so I can't do that 15 minutes a day. I have to find time whenever I can. And I tend to write in little vignettes sort of things or ideas, and then maybe after a couple months I start to put them all together and try and arrange them. So it's about creating little things like little cookies and then trying to make a cake out of it.
Frosting.
Yeah, and sometimes they make no sense and you have to throw them out. And that's the hardest part, is you think you're so proud of this one little cookie, you're like, this cookie just doesn't belong. Tom.
So you mentioned learning about this character from the letters like it was something sort of surprising to you out of your own creative process. So how much of the book and the story did you go into writing it knowing, and how much just sort of revealed itself to you as you went through the process?
That's a really good question, because when you're writing historical fiction, what I found is that there's so much base stuff you have to learn. So it's like going to college again. And you have to get the events down, you have to get the sensibilities, the pressures, all the things that are playing on the people who are in your story. Once you've got that, though, you can start to play around with it. So it's almost like you've built this little world and you've got your little people, and now you can make them do different things. But you also have to get in their head to figure out, why are they doing this, or how's this affecting them? I'm working on another novel now. It's much less time intensive because I don't have to do all that historical research. I find it really hard to get into the minds of people from an earlier era. And I don't know, I rely on you to tell me if I did it successfully, but yeah, that's the hardest part, I think.
I'm just curious if your book is unique in the sense that it's historical fiction that takes place in China and the United States, and I mean, I've never seen a book like it, so maybe there's a genre, or maybe there's people writing about this, but clearly we're not reading it. So I'm just curious if there is a group that's doing this and you're part of it, or if it's particularly unique.
So there's a lot of writers writing about China during the kind of pre-World War II period, or even into World War II. You have Lisa See, you have Amy Tan. So there's a lot of Chinese American writers who set things in Shanghai because it's a very exciting place. Not a lot about foreign service officers. So I think I've probably put myself in such a very complicated little niche that most people go, wow, why did you do that? You know, because it's not very simple. And that's kind of why I wanted to do it, because it was a challenge. But the answer is probably no, but there are other authors writing about that period specifically without jumping into other areas. One of the chapters I have goes to Brazil. The main character, rather than going to New York to sell steam traps, goes to Brazil to work for an oil company. And he thinks by going to Brazil, he'll escape all the problems of being blacklisted in the US. But his problems follow him to Brazil, too. So part of the reason of writing about Brazil was, when I wrote that chapter, I was really stuck before I'd written it, and so this became like a writer's block release, because I love listening to Brazilian music, and I thought, well, what was Brazil like in 1957? So I started doing research about that, and I thought, wow, there's a whole story here about Brazil. And you might read it and go, well, why the hell is he in Brazil? This is about China, you know? But that just is a reflection of my personality, and it does actually tie back into the story at some point, and you'll see how. All right, thank you everyone for coming. What's that? Oh yeah, there's snacks over here if you want.